Sarah Martinez stood in the fluorescent-lit waiting room of the Veterans Affairs office, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the manila folder containing her medical records. The sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with stale coffee filled her nostrils, reminding her of military hospitals she'd rather forget. Around her, other veterans waited in plastic chairs, some missing limbs, others bearing visible wounds that told stories of sacrifice and service. At 28, Sarah looked younger than her years, her petite frame often leading people to underestimate her. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her long dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. To most observers, she appeared to be just another young woman trying to navigate bureaucracy. Nothing about her outward appearance suggested the hell she had endured in Afghanistan. The receptionist called her name, and Sarah walked toward the office of Colonel Richard Hayes, a man known throughout the VA system for his no-nonsense approach to disability claims. His reputation preceded him: tough, skeptical, and protective of government resources. Many veterans feared his interviews, knowing that his approval could mean the difference between financial stability and destitution. Colonel Hayes was a career military man who had served in Vietnam and later in administrative roles during the Gulf War. Now in his 60s, he had dedicated his post-military career to ensuring that only legitimate claims received benefits. His office walls were lined with commendations and photographs from his service, creating an intimidating atmosphere that often left claimants feeling small and insignificant. As Sarah entered the office, Colonel Hayes barely looked up from her file. His weathered face showed years of military discipline, his gray hair cropped short in a regulation cut that he had maintained long after leaving active duty. He gestured toward a chair across from his desk without making eye contact, continuing to flip through pages of medical documentation. "Ms. Martinez," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I see here you're claiming PTSD and seeking disability compensation for what you describe as combat-related injuries." His tone was already skeptical, as if he had made up his mind before the meeting began. Sarah straightened in her chair, trying to project confidence despite the anxiety building in her chest. "Yes, sir. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division." Colonel Hayes finally looked up, his eyes scanning her appearance with obvious doubt. "Combat medic," he repeated slowly, as if tasting something unpleasant. "Ms. Martinez, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen countless young people come through this office with elaborate stories about their military service, hoping to receive benefits they haven't earned." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had expected skepticism, but not outright disbelief. "Sir, I have my DD-214 and medical records documenting my injuries." "Papers can be forged," the colonel replied dismissively, leaning back in his chair. "What I'm looking at is a young woman who appears to be in perfect health, claiming she was injured in combat. Do you understand how that looks to someone like me?" Sarah's heart began to race, the familiar symptoms of anxiety that had plagued her since her return from Afghanistan. The fluorescent light seemed brighter, the room smaller. She could feel herself beginning to dissociate, a common response to stress that her therapists had been helping her manage. "Sir, I was injured in an IED explosion in Kandahar province in March 2019. 3 soldiers died that day, and I was medevaced to Germany for treatment." Her voice remained steady despite the emotional turmoil she felt inside. Colonel Hayes made a note on his pad, but his expression remained unchanged. "Ms. Martinez, I've heard every excuse in the book. Young women especially seem to think they can claim combat injuries when they likely spent their deployments behind a desk on a secure base. The military has become very politically correct, but that doesn't change the reality of who actually sees combat." The sexism in his statement was unmistakable, and Sarah felt a flash of anger cut through her anxiety. She had faced this attitude before, the assumption that because she was a woman, her service was somehow less valid or dangerous than that of her male counterparts. "Colonel Hayes," she said carefully, "I understand your skepticism, but I'm not here to waste anyone's time. I served my country honorably and was injured while treating wounded soldiers under fire. I have witness statements and medical documentation to support my claim." The colonel stood up and walked around his desk, a power move designed to intimidate. At 6 feet tall, he towered over Sarah even when she was standing.
Ms. Martinez, I'm going to be frank with you.
In my experience, young people today feel entitled to compensation for every little inconvenience. Real combat veterans don't need to beg for recognition, their injuries speak for themselves.
Sarah felt tears threatening to form, but she blinked them back.
She had learned in the military never to show weakness, especially not to men who already doubted her capabilities.
Sir, I'm not begging for anything. I'm requesting the benefits I earned through my service and sacrifice.
Sacrifice? Colonel Hayes laughed, a harsh sound that filled the small office. Ms. Martinez, you look like you just stepped out of a college recruitment poster. I don't see any obvious injuries, any signs of the kind of trauma that real combat veterans carry with them. The dismissive laughter was more than Sarah could bear. She had spent months preparing for this meeting, gathering documentation, practicing her statements with her therapist. She had expected bureaucratic challenges, but not this level of personal attack on her service and integrity. Colonel, I have extensive medical records documenting my injuries and treatment, she said, her voice beginning to shake despite her efforts to remain composed.
Medical records can be exaggerated, he replied, returning to his seat.
Doctors these days are quick to diagnose PTSD for anyone who claims to have had a difficult experience.
It's become fashionable to be a victim.
Sarah stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor.
The sound echoed in the tense silence that followed.
She looked directly at Colonel Hayes, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of hurt and determination. Sir, I didn't come here to be lectured about fashionable victimhood. I came here because I was told this office would evaluate my claim fairly based on the evidence. Colonel Hayes waved dismissively.
The evidence I see is a healthy young woman making claims that don't match her appearance. If you were truly injured in combat, where are the scars? Where are the visible signs of your alleged trauma?
The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied her panic attacks. The room seemed to be closing in on her, and she could hear the distant sound of helicopters that always accompanied her flashbacks. Not all wounds are visible, sir, she managed to say, though her voice was barely above a whisper. That's exactly the kind of convenient excuse I'm talking about, Colonel Hayes replied, his tone growing more dismissive.
Real combat veterans bear the marks of their service. They don't come in here looking like they've never faced a day of hardship in their lives.
Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself using the techniques her therapist had taught her. She thought of her squad members who hadn't made it home, of the young soldier whose life she had tried to save even as shrapnel tore through her own body. When she opened her eyes, Colonel Hayes was staring at her with obvious impatience.
Ms. Martinez, I've heard your story, and, frankly, I find it difficult to believe.
Unless you have something more convincing than medical paperwork and emotional appeals, I'm afraid I'll have to deny your claim.
The finality in his voice was unmistakable.
Sarah realized that no amount of documentation or testimony would convince this man that her service was real, that her injuries were legitimate, that her sacrifice meant anything at all. She stood up slowly, gathering her manila folder with hands that were no longer trembling. Instead, they were steady with a quiet resolve that surprised even her. The fear and anxiety had been replaced by something else, a determination to prove that her service meant something, that the young soldiers who had died that day in Kandahar deserved better than this dismissal. Colonel Hayes, she said quietly, you've made it clear that you don't believe my story. But, before I leave, I want you to know that there are 3 families in America who will never see their sons again because of what happened that day. I was there, sir. I held those boys as they died, and I carry that with me every single day. Colonel Hayes remained unmoved, shuffling papers on his desk as if the meeting was already over. Ms. Martinez, I'm sure you believe your own story. But, belief doesn't qualify you for disability compensation. Sarah walked toward the door, her back straight despite the emotional weight she carried. As she reached for the handle, she turned back to face the colonel one last time. Sir, you asked for visible proof of my service. You'll have it. With that, she left the office, walking past the other veterans in the waiting room who looked up with understanding in their eyes. They had all been where she was now, fighting not just for benefits, but for recognition that their service had meaning. Outside the VA building, Sarah sat in her car for several minutes, letting the emotions wash over her. The panic attack she had been fighting finally came, leaving her gasping for breath as memories of Afghanistan flooded back. She saw the face of Private Johnson, barely 19 when he died in her arms. She remembered Sergeant Williams, whose last words were about his daughter's birthday party that he would never attend. But, through the panic and the pain, Sarah felt something else growing, a determination to return to that office and force Colonel Hayes to see the truth. She would not let his dismissal be the final word on her service or her sacrifice. As she drove home, Sarah began to formulate a plan. If Colonel Hayes wanted visible proof of her combat service, she would give it to him in a way he could never dismiss or ignore. The scars she carried were real, and it was time to show them to someone who had made it clear that only visible wounds were worth acknowledging. The next morning would bring a new day, and, with it, Sarah would return to face the colonel again. But, this time, she would come prepared to speak a language that even the most skeptical military bureaucrat would understand, the language of sacrifice written in flesh and blood. Sarah spent the evening in her small apartment, surrounded by the documentation of her military service that Colonel Hayes had dismissed so easily. Photos from Afghanistan lay scattered across her coffee table, images of her squad, the forward operating base where she had served, and the armored vehicles that had been her mobile medical unit. She picked up a photograph showing her team before the fateful mission. 5 young soldiers grinning at the camera, their faces dirty but optimistic. She traced her finger over the faces of Johnson, Williams, and Chen, the 3 who hadn't made it home. The survivor's guilt that her therapist had been helping her work through came flooding back with renewed intensity. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her best friend Maria, who had been her roommate before deployment and had helped her readjust to civilian life upon her return. "Hey, how did it go today?" Maria's voice was filled with concern. Sarah sank onto her couch, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. "Exactly as terrible as I expected, but worse. He didn't just doubt my claim, he basically accused me of lying about my entire service." "What? That's insane. You have all the documentation. How can he just ignore that? He thinks I'm too young and healthy looking to have been in real combat," said. "Real veterans carry visible marks of their service." Sarah's voice was bitter as she repeated the colonel's words. Maria was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Sarah, you know that's not true. You carry those marks every day. Just because someone can't see your panic attacks or your nightmares doesn't mean they're not real." "I know that, and you know that, but try explaining that to someone who's already made up his mind." Sarah stood up and walked to her bedroom mirror, looking at her reflection. Her therapist had taught her that while her emotional scars were invisible, they were no less valid than physical ones. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about her conversation with Colonel Hayes. His words echoed in her mind: real combat veterans bear the marks of their service. The irony wasn't lost on her, she did bear those marks, but they were hidden beneath her clothes, invisible to someone who was only looking at the surface. The next morning, Sarah woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since returning from Afghanistan. She had decided that if Colonel Hayes wanted to see visible proof of her service, she would provide it. But, first, she needed to prepare herself mentally for what would be an incredibly difficult and vulnerable moment. She called her therapist, Dr. Jennifer Collins, who had been working with her for the past 2 years. Dr. Collins was a specialist in treating combat veterans and understood the unique challenges that women in the military faced. "Sarah, I understand why you want to confront this man," Dr. Collins said during their phone conversation. "But I want you to think carefully about what showing your scars might cost you emotionally. You've worked so hard to reclaim ownership of your body and your story. Dr. Collins, I can't let him have the final word. Not when there are other women veterans who might face the same dismissal. If I don't fight this, who will?" The therapist was quiet for a moment, considering her patient's words. She knew Sarah's history, not just the medical facts but the emotional journey she had taken to heal from her trauma. "If you're determined to do this, let's talk about how to protect yourself emotionally. Remember, showing him your scars doesn't give him power over you, it demonstrates your strength and your choice to reveal the truth." After the conversation, Sarah felt more confident in her decision. She spent the rest of the morning reviewing her medical records, particularly the documentation from her initial treatment in Germany and her subsequent surgeries in the United States. The shrapnel from the IED had torn through the right side of her abdomen and back, requiring multiple surgeries to remove metal fragments and repair internal damage. The scars were extensive, a roadmap of her near-death experience etched permanently into her skin. She had hidden them carefully since her return, wearing clothing that covered the affected areas completely. Sarah called the VA office and requested another appointment with Colonel Hayes. The receptionist seemed surprised by the request, especially when Sarah insisted it had to be with the same officer who had handled her initial interview.
Ms. Martinez, the receptionist said, Colonel Hayes marked your file as a preliminary denial. Are you sure you want to meet with him again instead of going through the appeals process?
I'm certain, Sarah replied firmly.
Please tell him I have additional evidence to present regarding my claim. The appointment was scheduled for the following afternoon.
Sarah spent the intervening time in careful preparation, not just gathering her documents but preparing herself mentally for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of her life. She chose her clothing carefully, a button-down shirt that would allow her to show her scars without having to completely undress. She practiced what she would say, how she would maintain her dignity while revealing the most private evidence of her service.
The next day, Sarah arrived at the VA office 30 minutes early.
She sat in the same waiting room, but this time she felt different. The nervousness was still there, but it was accompanied by a steely determination that hadn't been present during her first visit.
When her name was called, Sarah walked into Colonel Hayes' office with her head held high. The colonel looked up with obvious irritation, clearly annoyed at having to revisit what he considered a closed case. Ms. Martinez, he said without preamble, I thought we had concluded our business yesterday. My assessment stands, your claim lacks credible evidence of combat-related injuries.
Sarah sat down across from his desk, placing her folder carefully in front of her. Colonel Hayes, you indicated yesterday that real combat veterans bear visible marks of their service.
I'm here to provide that evidence.
The colonel leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical.
Ms. Martinez, I've reviewed your file thoroughly. Unless you have new medical documentation that wasn't available yesterday, I don't see how this meeting will be productive.
Sir, you said that you don't see any obvious injuries, any signs of the kind of trauma that real combat veterans carry with them. You asked where the scars were, where the visible signs of my alleged trauma were.
Colonel Hayes nodded, his impatience evident.
That's correct. And I still don't see any evidence that would change my assessment. Sarah stood up slowly, her hands moving to the buttons of her shirt.
Colonel, you wanted to see the marks of my service.
They're here, hidden beneath clothes that I wear to protect other people from having to see what war does to the human body. The colonel's expression changed from irritation to confusion as he realized what Sarah was about to do. Ms. Martinez, I don't think this is appropriate, sir, Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she felt. You made it clear that only visible wounds would convince you that my service was real. These scars are the proof you demanded. With deliberate movements, Sarah unbuttoned her shirt and turned to show Colonel Hayes her right side and back. The office fell completely silent as the extent of her injuries became visible. The scars were extensive and unmistakable, a spider web of surgical marks, shrapnel entry wounds, and tissue damage that covered her entire right side from her ribs to her lower back. Some scars were thin white lines from surgical procedures, while others were irregularly shaped marks where shrapnel had torn through muscle and skin. Colonel Hayes stared in stunned silence, his earlier dismissiveness evaporating as he confronted the physical evidence of Sarah's combat experience. The scars told a story that no amount of documentation could convey, a story of violence, survival, and the kind of trauma that leaves permanent marks on both body and soul. These scars, Sarah said quietly, still facing away from the colonel, are from an IED that detonated under our convoy on March 15, 2019. The explosion killed 3 members of my squad and left me with internal injuries that required 7 surgeries to repair. She turned back to face Colonel Hayes, rebuttoning her shirt with hands that trembled slightly from the emotional weight of the moment. The largest piece of shrapnel missed my spine by less than 2 inches. The doctors said I was lucky to survive, let alone walk again.
Colonel Hayes remained silent, his face pale as he processed what he had seen. The arrogance and skepticism that had characterized their previous meeting had vanished, replaced by something that looked like shame. "Ms. Martinez," he began, his voice noticeably quieter than before, I owe you an apology." Sarah sat back down, her composure intact despite the vulnerability she had just displayed. "Sir, I didn't come here for an apology. I came here for the recognition that my service was real and that my injuries qualify me for the benefits I've earned." The colonel nodded slowly, reaching for her file with hands that seemed less steady than they had the day before. "Of course. I'll need to review your medical documentation again, with this new understanding of your injuries." "Sir, the medical documentation hasn't changed since yesterday. The only thing that's changed is that you've now seen the visible proof you said was necessary to validate my claim." Colonel Hayes looked down at his desk, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. "Ms. Martinez, I clearly misjudged your situation. These injuries are significant. I can see why you would have ongoing medical needs related to your service." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and sadness as she watched the powerful man across from her struggle with his obvious error in judgment. She had gotten what she came for, recognition of her service, but the cost of having to expose her most private wounds to a stranger was higher than she had anticipated. "Colonel, I want you to know that showing you these scars was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Not because I'm ashamed of them, but because they represent the worst day of my life, the day when I lost 3 friends and nearly lost my own life trying to save them." The colonel finally looked up, and Sarah could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before: respect, and perhaps understanding. "Ms. Martinez, I realize now that I made assumptions about you that were completely inappropriate and wrong. Your service and sacrifice are evident, and I should have recognized that from your documentation alone." Sarah stood up to leave, gathering her papers with the same dignity she had maintained throughout both meetings. "Colonel Hayes, I hope that the next woman veteran who walks into your office won't have to expose her deepest wounds to prove that her service was real." As she walked toward the door, Colonel Hayes called after her. "Ms. Martinez, your claim will be approved. You have my word on that." Sarah turned back one final time. "Thank you, sir. But, more importantly, I hope you'll remember this conversation the next time someone sits in that chair asking for recognition of their service." With that, Sarah left the office, knowing that she had not only secured her own benefits but had potentially changed how Colonel Hayes would approach future cases involving women veterans. The scars that she had hidden for so long had finally spoken louder than words, delivering a message that no amount of skepticism could dismiss. 3 weeks after her confrontation with Colonel Hayes, Sarah received a thick envelope in the mail from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, though this time the trembling was from anticipation rather than anxiety. Inside was her official disability rating approval, along with documentation for her benefits and a letter personally signed by Colonel Hayes. The letter was brief but significant. "Ms. Martinez, after thorough review of your medical documentation and service record, your claim for service-connected disabilities has been approved with a 70% disability rating. Your monthly compensation will begin immediately, and you are entitled to full VA medical benefits. I want to personally apologize for the initial handling of your case and commend you for your service and sacrifice." Sarah sat in her kitchen, staring at the papers that represented years of struggle and validation. The financial relief was important, but more significant was the official recognition that her service had meaning and that her injuries were real. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria: "Coffee later? Want to hear how things went with your appeal?" Sarah smiled as she typed back, "Approved. Full benefits. I'll tell you everything when I see you." But, even as she celebrated this personal victory, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about other women veterans who might face similar skepticism. She had been fortunate to have documentation, medical records, and the strength to advocate for herself. Not everyone would be so equipped to fight bureaucratic disbelief. That evening, Sarah called Dr. Collins to share the news and discuss her next steps. The therapist had been instrumental in helping her prepare for the emotional challenge of revealing her scars to Colonel Hayes. "Sarah, I'm proud of you for fighting for what you deserved," Dr. Collins said. "But I want to check in on how you're processing everything. That was an incredibly vulnerable moment for you." Sarah considered the question carefully.
Honestly, Dr. Collins, it was traumatic to expose those scars to him. But it was also empowering. For the first time since I'd been home, I felt like my service was truly seen and acknowledged.
That's a healthy way to process it. Have you given any thought to what you want to do moving forward? Sarah had been thinking about exactly that question.
I want to help other women veterans navigate this system.
What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else. Over the next several months, Sarah threw herself into veteran advocacy work.
She began by reaching out to local women veteran organizations, sharing her story and offering to help others prepare for their disability claims. Her experience with Colonel Hayes had taught her the importance of being prepared not just with documentation, but with the emotional resilience to face skepticism. She started a support group that met monthly at the local VFW hall. The group focused specifically on women veterans dealing with invisible injuries, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and other conditions that weren't immediately apparent to outside observers.
Sarah's story became a powerful example of perseverance and self-advocacy.
One evening at a support group meeting, a young woman named Rebecca shared her own experience with the VA system. She had been a military police officer in Iraq and was struggling to get her PTSD claim approved. "They keep asking me what combat I saw," Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. "I tell them about the mortars, the roadside bombs, the convoys we escorted, but they act like because I wasn't infantry, my trauma isn't real." Sarah recognized the pain in Rebecca's voice, the same frustration and invalidation she had experienced with Colonel Hayes.
"Rebecca, your trauma is real whether or not they understand it. Don't let anyone else define your service or your injuries."
The group rallied around Rebecca, helping her organize her documentation and prepare for her next VA appointment. Sarah coached her on how to present her case and, more importantly, how to maintain her dignity in the face of potential skepticism. 6 months after her own victory, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Colonel Hayes himself. She was surprised to hear from him, wondering what could have prompted him to reach out. "Ms. Martinez," his voice carried a humility that hadn't been present during their office meetings.
"I hope I'm not overstepping by calling you directly.
I wanted to let you know that your case has had an impact on how we handle claims here at the VA."
Sarah was intrigued. "What kind of impact, sir?"
"Well, I've been working with my staff to implement new training protocols for interviewing veterans, especially women veterans. We're focusing on recognizing that not all service-connected injuries are visible, and that skepticism should never be the default approach to any claim." Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that change was happening, but sadness that it had taken her traumatic experience to prompt it. "That's good to hear, Colonel. I hope it helps other veterans avoid what I went through. Ms. Martinez, I wonder if you would consider speaking to our staff about your experience."
"I think hearing directly from someone who was affected by our previous approach would be valuable training." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the request.
Speaking to VA staff would mean revisiting the painful details of her experience, but it could also prevent other veterans from facing similar treatment.
"I'd be willing to do that, Colonel.
But I want to bring some of the other women from my support group with me.
This isn't just about my experience, it's about a systemic problem that affects many veterans."
"Of course.
That would be even more valuable."
2 months later, Sarah stood in a conference room at the VA regional office, facing a group of 20 staff members including claims processors, medical personnel, and administrative officers. Colonel Hayes introduced her with genuine respect, acknowledging the mistakes that had been made in handling her case. Sarah began her presentation by showing photos from her deployment, images of her working as a combat medic, treating wounded soldiers under fire, and living in the harsh conditions of Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan. She wanted the staff to see her not as a young woman making dubious claims, but as a professional soldier who had served with distinction. "I want to start by saying that I don't share my story for sympathy," Sarah began. "I share it because the way my claim was initially handled represents a failure in the system that's supposed to support veterans." She walked the staff through her experience with Colonel Hayes, describing the assumption that her service wasn't real, the dismissal of her documentation, and the impossible standard she was held to in proving her injuries. When Colonel Hayes told me that real combat veterans bear visible marks of their service, he wasn't wrong, Sarah said. But he was looking in the wrong place. The marks of my service aren't just the physical scars that I eventually showed him. They're in my medical records documenting 7 surgeries. They're in the witness statements from my squad members. They're in the commendation I received for treating wounded soldiers while under enemy fire. The room was completely silent as Sarah continued. But, most importantly, the marks of my service are in the invisible wounds that I carry every day, the nightmares about friends who didn't come home, the panic attacks triggered by loud noises, and the survivor's guilt that makes me question why I lived when better soldiers died. One of the younger staff members raised her hand. Ms. Martinez, how can we better recognize when someone is dealing with invisible injuries? Sarah smiled at the question. Start by believing veterans when they tell you about their service. Don't make them prove that they're worthy of your attention. And remember that courage in combat doesn't look the same for everyone. A 19-year-old medic treating wounded soldiers while mortars fall around her is showing just as much courage as any infantry soldier. After her presentation, several staff members approached Sarah privately to thank her for her candor and to share their own experiences as veterans. She realized that even within the VA system, there were people who understood the challenges veterans faced and wanted to do better. Rebecca, who had attended the presentation as part of Sarah's support group, was visibly emotional as they left the building. Sarah, do you think this will really change things? I don't know if one presentation can change everything, Sarah replied. But it's a start. And if it helps even one veteran avoid what we went through, then it was worth it. 6 months after the training session, Sarah received another call from Colonel Hayes. This time, he had good news to share. Ms. Martinez, I wanted to let you know that we've seen a significant improvement in our approval rates for women veterans' disability claims. More importantly, we've received positive feedback from veterans about their experience with our staff. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. That's wonderful to hear, Colonel. What specifically has changed? Well, we've implemented the training protocols we discussed, but we've also changed our entire approach to initial interviews. Instead of starting with skepticism, we start with the assumption that veterans are telling the truth about their service. We ask better questions, we listen more carefully, and we look at the whole picture rather than just searching for reasons to deny claims. Sarah knew that this was exactly the kind of systemic change that could help countless veterans. Colonel, I want you to know that our conversation, as difficult as it was, led to something really important. You could have doubled down on your original position, but instead you chose to learn and grow. Ms. Martinez, you taught me that questioning a veteran's service is never appropriate. My job is to help veterans access the benefits they've earned, not to play detective or make judgments about whose service was real enough to deserve recognition. As Sarah hung up the phone, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The scars on her body would always be there, reminders of the worst day of her military service. But those same scars had become instruments of change, speaking louder than words to force recognition not just of her service, but of the service of countless other women veterans. She thought about Private Johnson, Sergeant Williams, and Corporal Chen, the 3 soldiers who had died in the IED explosion that had left her scarred. Their sacrifice had meaning, and her survival carried the responsibility to honor that meaning. Sarah's advocacy work continued to grow. She was invited to speak at veterans conferences across the country, sharing her story and training VA staff in multiple regions. She became a voice for women veterans who had been dismissed, doubted, or ignored by the very system that was supposed to support them. 1 year after her confrontation with Colonel Hayes, Sarah received a letter from a young woman veteran in Texas. The letter read, Ms. Martinez, I heard you speak at the VA training in Dallas. Because of the changes your story helped create, my claim was approved on the first try. The interviewer listened to my story, believed my documentation, and treated me with respect throughout the process. Thank you for fighting not just for yourself, but for all of us.
Sarah kept that letter on her desk as a reminder that individual courage could create ripple effects that touched lives across the country. Her scars had spoken louder than words, but their message had been heard far beyond the walls of Colonel Hayes's office. The transformation wasn't complete. There were still veterans facing skepticism and bureaucratic obstacles, but progress was being made. Sarah's story had become part of a larger conversation about how society honors and supports those who serve in the military. As she continued her advocacy work, Sarah often thought about that day when she had made the difficult decision to show her scars to Colonel Hayes. It had been one of the most vulnerable moments of her life, but it had also been one of the most powerful. Sometimes, she realized, the truth needs to be made visible before it can be heard. Her scars would always be there, but they were no longer just reminders of trauma. They had become symbols of resilience, advocacy, and the power of one person's courage to create change for many others. In the end, they had spoken louder than words, and their message continued to echo in VA offices across the country.